There is something that Yellowstone National Park doesn't mention on its tourist posters. Something that rangers avoid putting in their official reports. It isn't the sleeping volcano beneath the earth, nor the bears that wander through the trees at the edge of dusk. It's something different, something that has no scientific classification, that appears in no local wildlife guide, and that, on one specific night of the full moon, was accidentally captured by a trail camera installed at 15,400 feet above sea level on the edges of the Hayden Valley. The video file circulated for weeks in paranormal investigation forums before vanishing from the internet without explanation. Amateur researchers tried to track it down. Some claimed to have made copies. Others swore the copies were corrupted or that they had received calls asking them to delete everything. None of these accounts were officially verified. What is known with the consistency that independent testimonies sometimes create unintentionally is that the video showed a figure too large to be a bear. That moved in a way too wrong to be human, and that stopped in front of the camera for 22 seconds, staring directly into the lens. What follows is not the video. It is the story behind it. The story of Marcus Thompson, a 33-year-old man who had arrived at Yellowstone 4 days earlier, checked in under a fake name at a hostel in West Thumb, and whom no one would ever have connected to that footage had he not left behind traces that were not footprints. Marcus was not a monster by choice. That is the hardest part to understand. He had not asked to be what he was. He had signed no contract, made no conscious decision that had put him in that position. What lived inside him was older than any choice he could have made. Something that had been awakened years before in a forest in Montana and that had since slept inside his body like an ember buried under ash. Waiting. Always waiting for the right moment. When he arrived at Yellowstone, the reasoning was simple: isolation. If the transformation came, and he knew it would come, he needed to be far enough from any human being that the damage would be minimal. The park was enormous. It had zones closed to the public. It had enough silence to swallow anything. He had calculated every detail with the cold precision of someone who had spent years trying to tame something that refuses to be tamed. The problem with calculations made by a mind that is beginning to crack is that the numbers never add up. Marcus had set up camp at a remote point in the park, several miles from any official trail, hidden among pine trees and outcroppings of volcanic rock that the wind had sculpted into shapes that looked like faces. He had arrived there 2 days before the full moon, deliberately, to have time to get his bearings, to memorize exits, to learn the terrain. It was a ritual he had developed over time, a survival routine disguised as a camping trip. During the day, he walked. He observed. He jotted notes in a journal he would later burn. The patterns of the park rangers, their patrol schedules, the wildlife monitoring cameras. Not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Each piece of information was a variable that could mean the difference between a night no one would know about and a catastrophe. He had learned to think this way. Life had taught him that there was a version of himself that didn't care about consequences, and that the only person responsible for keeping that version in check was himself. The trail camera he had identified was roughly 1.25 miles from his campsite. It was a standard model from the park's monitoring service. Black, small, mounted to a pine trunk about 5 feet off the ground. He had walked past it intentionally during one of his daytime reconnaissance runs, checking the angle, estimating the field of view. He had concluded that the route he planned to take during the night would skirt that point with sufficient margin. He had concluded wrong. The second day at the campsite was quiet, with that background tension he knew well, that low vibration under the skin, like an electrical current that doesn't quite hurt but never stops. He ate little, slept less, lay awake watching the stars drift across the gap between the treetops, trying to keep his mind anchored on concrete things, the smell of resin, the temperature of the air, the sound of the nearby creek, anything that was real and measurable and that belonged to the world he could still inhabit as a man. On the morning of the third day, the sky had a different quality, a heavy clarity. Marcus recognized that kind of light. It always appeared close to the cycle, as if the atmosphere knew what was coming before his own body would admit it. There were things doctors had tried to explain over the years. There were diagnoses that were convenient approximations of something clinical language simply could not contain. He had learned not to argue anymore. He had learned that there was a difference between being understood and being safe, and that most of the time it was only possible to choose one of the two. On that third day, he chose safety. He began to prepare. The full moon doesn't come on suddenly. That is what the movies always get wrong. It doesn't appear and the transformation begins. The process is much slower, and because of that, much crueler. It starts hours before nightfall, like a pressure behind the eyes, a diffuse warmth in the bones, with no anatomical cause that doesn't respond to painkillers. Marcus had tried to document that progression in the early years. He stopped when he realized that every description he wrote was more inadequate than the one before. With darkness approaching, he was sitting at the edge of his improvised campsite, back against a rock, staring at the tree line. The moon was rising behind the mountains. He could feel it before he saw it, like a weight growing heavier on his shoulders. The pressure in his bones had become something deeper, more defined. A pain that was also desire, and for that reason harder to resist than pure pain. He had laced his boots with unusual tightness. He had left his journal and gear inside a canvas bag tied to a tree. He had mentally confirmed there was no one within miles of him. And then he had sat down and begun to wait. Not for the transformation, because waiting for the transformation was an illusion of control he had abandoned long ago. He had sat down to witness, to be the last version of himself before the other version took over the space. The moon appeared above the mountain line like a living thing, and Marcus Thompson began to come apart. That is not an exaggerated word. It is the most precise one that exists for what happens, an unraveling. The structure of the body he had inhabited for 33 years began to reorganize beneath his skin with a violence that was simultaneously mechanical and organic. His shoulders widened with a crack that echoed off the rocks. His spine curved forward into an arch that belonged to no human being. His hands balled into fists as his fingers lengthened, and his nails became black claws that tore into the earth below him. His shirt gave along the back. His pants split at the thighs. What was emerging was too large for any human clothing to contain. The fur came fast, dark, thick, covering every inch of skin in waves that began at the torso and spread to the extremities. The face came last, and it was the worst, because Marcus was still conscious enough to feel his skull reshape itself, his muzzle push forward, his teeth multiplying in rows of fangs that no longer fit in the jaw that had been his. A sound came from his throat that was simultaneously human and absolutely not human. Something that began as a moan and ended as a howl. 280 pounds of creature rose from the floor of Yellowstone. And the eyes were still Marcus Thompson's. The creature stood motionless for a long moment, orienting its senses. The world had transformed along with it, not visibly, but in terms of perception. Its sense of smell had a range of miles. Its hearing picked up every breath of every animal within a radius that Marcus's human mind could not have calculated, but that the creature's mind processed effortlessly. The warmth of living bodies appeared as soft blurs against the cold blue of the night. There was an elk 800 meters away. There were 2 coyotes much farther off. There was the creek with its constant noise. And there was the wind coming down from the mountains carrying the scent of snow and volcanic sulfur. And there was, much closer than Marcus had calculated, a human being. It was not a ranger. It was not a lost hiker. It was a young man, probably in his early 20s, who had set up amateur monitoring cameras along a personal route, searching for evidence of rare wildlife activity, a practice many enthusiasts carried out in the park, informally, without necessarily following all the official protocols. This man was a little over a mile away, inside an ultralight camping tent, making no noise, no light, trying to make himself invisible so as not to disturb the animals he hoped to photograph. He had made himself invisible to the animals, not to the creature. The werewolf moved through the forest at a speed that didn't match the size of its body, silent in a way that defied logic, every step precise, every branch avoided before any contact, as if the terrain were a map the creature had memorized by instinct. Yet within that fluid, predatory movement, something was fighting the direction, a friction. Marcus Thompson had not disappeared entirely. He was still there, in a deeper layer, pulling against the trajectory like a man trying to hold back a horse that has already bolted. The creature stopped a few yards from the tent. It tilted its head at an angle that strangely seemed more human than any of its previous movements, like someone in doubt. Its eyes, even in the darkness, carried that unsettling quality. Pain. Not the pain of a frustrated predator. The pain of someone who knew exactly what was happening and could do nothing about it. The trail camera was 70 meters away. The angle was perfect. The motion sensor had activated the device 30 seconds earlier, and the file was being recorded in real time. 19 seconds, until the moment the werewolf raised its head and for some reason that no video data would ever be able to explain, turned its gaze directly toward it. Not toward the camera as an object, toward the camera as a witness. It stood still for 22 seconds. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness in the opposite direction from the tent, as if it had made a decision. As if that part within, that buried ember called Marcus Thompson, was still capable of making decisions. The young man inside the tent woke up a short while later. There was no sound to explain the waking. It was the kind of sudden awareness the body produces when something in the environment has changed in a way the eyes haven't registered yet, but that the oldest instincts recognize immediately. He lay still in his sleeping bag, breathing as little as possible, listening. There was nothing, only the wind and the creek and the immense silence of Yellowstone at night. But the silence had changed in quality. There was a silence that was the absence of sound, and there was a silence that was the presence of something that had hushed everything around it. That second kind was what surrounded the tent now, the kind of stillness that animals produce when something larger than them is nearby, the kind of stillness that exists not because nothing is happening, but because everything that had been happening stopped, all at once, with collective urgency. He waited until dawn to go outside. When he did, he found the cameras intact. He found the terrain around him with no obvious signs of disturbance. He began reviewing the files with the unconcern of someone expecting to have captured images of elk or maybe a coyote. When he reached camera number 4, the one that sat 70 meters from where he had been sleeping, what he saw made him involuntarily take a step back. He watched the video 4 times, each time pausing on the same frame. The creature staring directly into the lens. The eyes. There was something in the eyes that did not belong to the visual vocabulary of any animal he knew. An expression that was not aggression, not curiosity, not fear. It was something else. It was something that took him days trying to name, and that he eventually described in the online forums simply as recognition. As if the creature knew it was being filmed and had chosen, deliberately, to remain in frame for that exact length of time. Meanwhile, miles away, Marcus Thompson woke on the forest floor with the cold of dawn on his face and his clothes destroyed in shreds. This was always the worst moment, the reassimilation, the process of piecing together the human consciousness over the fragment of memory the night had left behind. He never remembered everything. There were large, dark gaps in the middle of the night's memory, and what remained were impressions, smells, directions, thermal sensations. The impression from this night was strange. There was something about a black rectangle on a tree. There was something about a choice. He found his own scratches on the palms of his hands, on the inside made by the claws while the creature had clenched its fists. He had learned to read those signs like an alphabet of what had happened in the hours he could no longer access. Internal scratches usually meant restraint. They meant something had been stopped. He didn't know what, but he felt, with an intensity that brought him to his knees on the floor of Yellowstone, something close to gratitude. The video appeared in the forums days later. It circulated quietly at first, shared among small groups, analyzed frame by people accustomed to pulling images apart in search of editing tricks. And what those people found, repeatedly, independently, was the same uncomfortable conclusion. There was no visible trick. The resolution was good enough to see texture. The creature's shadow was consistent with the position of the moonlight. The movement did not show the typical artifacts of amateur CGI. And the eyes that every analyst mentioned at some point in the process, invariably as if they couldn't help it. The eyes had a quality that some called depth, and that others simply couldn't name with technical language. The video disappeared from the servers where it had been hosted before any formal analysis could be completed. Some links redirected to error pages. Others simply ceased to exist without a message. The user who had made the original upload did not respond to any private messages. The account was eventually deleted without public explanation. These patterns proved nothing. Files disappear for mundane reasons all the time. Accounts get deleted. Servers fail. Any honest investigator would have to admit as much. What honest investigators have more trouble admitting is why the disappearance followed such a specific pattern. Why the copies that some users claim to have made never resurfaced. Why the young man who had captured the video went completely silent after a week of intense forum activity, as if a door had been shut from the inside. Why the report that a ranger had apparently started regarding unusual animal activity in that area of the park was nowhere in the public records when someone went to check months later. Marcus Thompson left Yellowstone 2 days after the full moon, the same way he had arrived. Without making noise, without drawing attention, checked in under a name no one would connect to him. He went back to the road, back to the life he had built in the gaps of the normal world. A life made of intervals between moons, of carefully maintained distances, of weekdays spent in generic cities where no one knew his real name. He didn't know about the video. He never knew. Or perhaps he knew in a way he could not consciously articulate. That flash of impression about the black camera on the tree, those 22 seconds of stillness that the fragmented memory had preserved with a sharpness disproportionate to the rest of the night. What is certain is that he is still out there, somewhere, counting days between moons with the obsessive precision of someone who knows exactly what he is trying to contain, choosing isolation not as escape, but as the only act of protection still within his reach. And on some server no one can access anymore, there is a video file. 22 seconds. A massive creature, motionless, looking at a camera it should not have been able to see in the dark, with eyes that were undeniably human, whether what was filmed at Yellowstone that night was an animal, a man, or something that exists in the impossible space between the two. That question remains exactly where the video left it, open, in the dark, waiting.